Have you ever wondered why we just sing and don't use musical instruments in the churches of Christ? Some are shocked when they find out that we don't use them. Yes, we know men like David and others in the Old Testament used them as part of their worship to God. In fact, musical instruments were commanded to be used in the Old Testament in passages such as 2 Chronicles 29:25. And he stationed the Levite in the house of the Lord with cymbals, with stringed instruments, and with harps, according to the commandment of David, of Gad, the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet. For thus was the commandment of the Lord by his prophets. We are fully aware of psalms that say things like this. In Psalms 150, verse number 3, praise him with the sound of the trumpet. Praise him with the lute and harp. Praise him with the timbrel and dance. Praise him with stringed instruments and flutes. Praise him with loud cymbals. Praise him with clashing cymbals. So why in the world do we not use them? Well, the answer is quite simple. Our authority comes from the New Testament, not the Old Testament, because when Jesus died on the cross, he put an end to the covenant under the Old Testament, and he brought forth a new covenant with a new set of commands. You can see this in verses like Colossians 2, verse 14, and Ephesians 2, verses 14 through 15. Since we are under a new covenant, we must use it as our authority and not use the old covenant. While using musical instruments were commanded under the old, they are not commanded under the new covenant. Instead, we are commanded to sing. Ephesians 5, verse 18, and do not be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Colossians 3, verse 16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. Every example we have in the New Testament is of people singing to God and never playing musical instruments. So we don't use musical instruments because we want to do what God has commanded us. As Paul said in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 6, now these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written. When you add things that God has not commanded, it is considered vain worship. It is agreed by countless scholars and historians that musical instruments were not used in the early church. In fact, the earliest mentioning of their introduction didn't come until the 5th or 6th century. In the Catholic Church, Pope Vitalian sanctioned their use for the first time in AD 670. This was not done without controversy, because notice what the Catholic Encyclopedia says about this. The first Christians were of too spiritual fiber to substitute lifeless instruments for or to use them to accompany the human voice. The rejection of all musical instruments from Christian worship is consistent among the fathers. The idea of using musical instruments didn't catch on very fast at all, and it always caused great controversy and division wherever it was introduced. It wasn't until 1851 and beyond that people started embracing the use of instruments in their worship to God. I want to share with you several quotes from denominational preachers from the past. John Calvin, founder of the Presbyterian Church, wrote this, musical instruments in celebrating the praise of God would be no more suitable than the burning of incense, the lighting of lamps, or the restoration of other shadows of the law. John Wesley, founder of the Methodist Church, wrote, I have no objection to instruments of music in our chapels, provided they are neither heard nor seen. Adam Clarke, famous Methodist commentator, music as a science I esteem and admire, But instruments of music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. Martin Luther called the organ an ensign of Bel. Charles H. Spurgeon, a well-known Baptist preacher, wrote this: "I would soon attempt to pray to God with machinery as to sing to Him with machinery." J. H. Garrison of the Christian Church: "There is no command in the New Testament, Greek or English, commanding the use of the instrument." At one time, all these different denominations represented here understood that the use of musical instruments was not to be used in our worship to God. Yet sadly, every single one of these denominations use musical instruments as part of their worship to God today. We in the churches of Christ simply uphold what God commanded in His Word because we love God and we want to give Him what He asked for, which is why we only sing. So now ask yourself the question, why would you want to use musical instruments to worship God?